This is a review of Spanish 3 that you can use when you're studying for the final, but also you can refer to this for the rest of your life. The first thing that we talked about in Spanish 3 was preterite versus imperfect. The preterite is used for one-time actions, completed actions, actions in a sequence of events, and actions within a time frame. The preterite is also used for interrupting actions. The AR endings are aste, o, amos, asteis, aron, and the ER-IR endings are iste, yo, imos, isteis, ieron. The imperfect tense is used for habitual actions, ongoing actions, stuff that you did while you were growing up, setting the scene, talking about the weather, describing emotions, talking about someone's age, telling time, and interrupted actions. The AR endings are aba, abas, aba, abamos, abais, aban. The passive voice is a style of sentence that puts emphasis on the action rather than the person doing the action. The passive voice is formed by conjugating ser in the preterite and then using the past participle. The conjugations of ser in the preterite are fui, fuiste, fue, fuimos, fuisteis, fueron. And the past participles end in ado if they're AR verbs and ido if they're ER and IR verbs. Of course, there are some irregular past participles, so you'll have to review those. In the passive voice, the past participle changes to match the subject of the sentence. In other words, you have to look and see if the subject of the sentence is masculine or feminine, singular or plural. For example, la manzana fue comida por el niño. The apple was eaten by the child. Since apple is singular and feminine, we change comido to comida. Impersonal se is another way to use the passive voice in Spanish and has the exact same meaning. To make the impersonal se, you make the verb reflexive and conjugate it in the preterite. The subject of the sentence comes after the verb. So my example is, se limpió la pizarra. That means the board was cleaned. All we had to do was make limpiar reflexive. The present perfect expresses something that has happened in the past. Usually it's for something that happened earlier that day or for something that's only happened once. To make the present perfect, you conjugate haber in the present tense and you include the past participle of whatever verb you want. The conjugations of haber in the present tense are has, a, hemos, habéis, han. And the past participles are just like in the passive voice. AR past participles end in ado, and ER and IR end in ido. But unlike the passive voice, with the present perfect, the past participle does not change to match the subject. In other words, it always ends in O. Pluperfect is like the present perfect in the past. It expresses something that had happened, usually before something else. To form the pluperfect, you conjugate haber in the imperfect, and then you include the past participle of whatever verb you want to conjugate. So the endings for haber in the imperfect are había, habías, había, habíamos, habíais, habían. And the past participles once again end in ado for AR verbs and ido for ER and IR verbs. And the past participle does not change to match the subject, so it always ends in O. The subjunctive doesn't really exist in English, so it's hard to explain. But the conjugations work like this. Step 1, start with the yo form in the present tense of whatever verb you want to conjugate. Step 2, drop the o. And step 3, add the opposite ending, which would be a for ER and IR verbs and e for AR verbs. And then you have to conjugate the verb. In other words, if it's tú, you add an s. If it's nosotros, you add a mos. If it's ustedes, you add an n, etc. There are some irregular verbs in the preterite. There are some verbs that follow the pattern, the 4-step pattern, but there are some that are totally irregular. The ones that are totally irregular are ir, which is vaya, ser, which is sea, estar, which is este, and dar, which is de. The rest of the irregular verbs in the subjunctive aren't really irregular because they follow the four-step process. They just have irregular yo forms. We learned wedding to remember when to use the subjunctive. The W stands for wish, like in espero que. The E stands for emotion, like es triste que, es sorprendente que, me gusta que. Basically any expression that shows emotion. One of the D's is for desire, like quiero que, recomiendo que, digo que. It's telling somebody that you want them to do something else. The other D is doubt, dudo que, or no creo que. And then the I is impersonal statement. So this is kind of like a general truth, like es importante que, es necesario que. N is for negation, which really all you have to do is put a no in front of any of the previous letters, like no quiero que, or no espero que, or no es triste que. And then finally, the G stands for God willing, which is a special expression in Spanish that's ojalá. And with ojalá, you can put a K afterwards, or you can just say ojalá and then the verb and the subjunctive. Wedding expresses something called nominative clauses. Nominative clauses basically take the place of a noun in the sentence. But to sum it up, really, there are two rules. In order to use the subjunctive, you need to follow in criteria. Rule 1. There must be at least two verbs in the sentence, and rule 2, there must be a subject change. If rule number 1 is not met, in other words, if there's only one verb in the sentence, leave the verb in the indicative mood. The indicative is all the tenses that we've learned so far up until the subjunctive. So, yo voy al parque. There's only one verb, so it should stay in the indicative. If rule number 2 is not met, in other words, if there's not a subject change in the sentence, leave the second verb in the infinitive. For example, I hope that I go to the park. Since I am the subject of the first part of the sentence and the second part of the sentence, I just need to leave the second verb in the infinitive. Yo espero ir al parque. Indicative expressions, otherwise voces, are expressions that take the indicative mood. Remember, that's like present tense and preterite tense and imperfect tense, etc. But these indicative expressions take the subjunctive mood if there's a no in front of them. Es verdad que, es obvio que, es cierto que, es evidente que, and es seguro que. The present perfect subjunctive expresses things that have happened in the past in the subjunctive. To make the present perfect subjunctive, you conjugate haber in the subjunctive, and then also you add the past participle of whatever verb you want to conjugate. Haber in the subjunctive goes like this. Haya, hayas, haya, hayamos, hayáis, hayan. And the past participles end in ado if they're AR verbs, and ido if they're ER and IR verbs. The past participle does not change to match the subject, so it always ends in O. And remember, there are a few irregular past participles, so you should probably review those too. Now let's talk about adjective clauses, which is one of my favorite things about the subjunctive. An adjective clause takes the place of an adjective in a sentence. Like, I want a nice pencil versus I want a pencil that erases well. A pencil that erases well is an adjective clause because it replaces the adjective nice. So in Spanish, if the person that you're talking about or the object that you're talking about is somebody that you know, you use the indicative. Yo tengo un amigo que habla español. I know that my friend speaks Spanish. And I know that I have that friend, so I keep it in the indicative. But if the person or object is something that you don't know, that's when you use the subjunctive. Quieres un amigo que sea de otro país. You want a friend that's from another country, but you don't necessarily know that person. And if the person doesn't exist at all, you also use the subjunctive. No hay nadie que hable japonés. There is nobody here that speaks Japanese. If there is nobody and you're sure that they don't exist, it goes in the subjunctive. The future tense expresses things that will happen with certainty, but is also used to make guesses and conclusions. The endings are the same for all of the verbs, doesn't matter if they're AR or ER or IR, and the endings attached to the infinitive, which is a little tricky. The endings are as, a, hemos, es, an, with an accent in every single form except for nosotros. Some verbs have irregular stems, but there are no irregular endings, which is pretty fantastic. The future perfect expresses things that will have happened in the future, and also it's used to make guesses and conclusions. To form the future perfect, you conjugate haber in the future tense, and you add the past participle of whatever verb you want to conjugate. So the conjugations of haber are habré, habrás, habrá, habremos, habréis, habrán. And the past participles are hado and ido. Past participle doesn't change to match the subject. It always ends in o. Conditional expresses what would happen under given conditions. The endings are the same for all the verbs, just like the future tense, and attached to the infinitive, just like the future tense. The endings are ia, ias, ia, iamos, iais, ian. Some of the verbs have irregular stems, just like the future tense, but there are no irregular endings. And finally, we have the conditional perfect. Conditional perfect expresses what would have happened under certain conditions. It's formed by conjugating haber in the conditional and then adding the past participle of whatever verb you want to conjugate. The conjugations of haber in the conditional are habría, habrías, habría, habríamos, habríais, y habrían. And of course, the past participles end in hado and ido. The conditional perfect implies that something would have happened, but it didn't. Es todo, y te deseo mucha suerte en el examen.